Everybody has been talking about how the United States debt is exploding higher.
If you stacked up the full debt of the United States in $100 bills, you could make not one, not two, but 13 piles of cash as tall as the Washington Monument.
Right now, it's approaching $32 trillion. And I think it's going to $100 trillion sooner than later. I'm going to give you 3 reasons why. Let's start with reason number 1. It's all about the trend. We look at a chart going back to 2000 all the way to 2023. Now, what I've done is I've added some years to this chart. We go 2028 and 2033, but we'll get into that in just a moment. On the left, we go from 0 trillion up to 50 trillion. Keep in mind, this chart, the actual real chart I'm using, only goes up to $32 trillion. So we start back here in 2000. What I want you to notice is we had a recession, call it 2001. During this recession, the government deficit spending was pretty flat, pretty tamed by today's standards. So the United States debt during that recession didn't go up that much, almost flat. Okay. Then after the recession, then the government really starts to ramp up the deficit spending. So you can see the trajectory of the government debt getting steeper, or now it starts to get, we'll just call this steep. But then what happens during the GFC is we have another recession. But this time, the government's response is far, far different. You guys remember what happened? The drunk, insolvent Uncle Sam was spending money like the drunken sailor he is. And the deficits really started to go up. You can see that on the chart. But after the recession, the deficits continued to climb, but at a much steeper angle than they were prior to the GFC. Okay, so now let's go ahead and fast forward to the next recession, the cerveza sickness, and what happens to deficit spending? What happens to the government debt? Oh, now they go from spending, let's say, $4 trillion to spending $10 trillion over a similar time frame. And then what happens after the recession is over? The deficit spending, does it stop? Absolutely not. It continues to go up at a steeper angle than it went up after the GFC. I think you can tell where I'm going with this, can't you? Because this pretty much takes us to the end of the actual chart. But what we can do is just extrapolate this forward and look at the overall trend. So most of you know from watching my videos, the yield curve is currently inverted, which means we will likely have a recession. Who knows? The next 3 months, 6 months, year, we could be in a recession right now. But going all the way back to 1950, when you get an inversion of the yield curve, we'll call it the 2-year and the 10-year, you almost always get a recession. Okay, so let's think that through. Assuming that we get a recession in the next year and looking at what the government has done over the last 20 years, how much deficit spending do you think your drunk, insolvent Uncle Sam will do this time? My guess would be more than they did during the cerveza sickness, which was way more than they did during the GFC. Now let's go ahead and add some actual numbers to it to make sure that we're all on the same page. Okay, during the GFC, government deficit spending, during that 3-year period, we'll call it from 2008 roughly to 2011, the government debt went up by $4 trillion. During the cerveza sickness, $10 trillion. See what happened? It more than doubled. So I think it's safe to assume that during the next, we'll call it the next financial crisis, and this is key, that the government deficit spending will go up even more. Therefore, the government debt will go up even more than it did during COVID. Therefore, if we did 10 trillion here, most likely we're going to do 15 trillion. Nice handwriting. Oh, but most likely they'll do 15 trillion during the next crisis. And I think it's safe to assume that even after the next crisis is over, like it's done pretty much every single time in the past, the deficits will continue, but they'll go up at a steeper angle. Let's go ahead and take another step. Let's look further into the future, not just at the next catastrophe or GFC 2.0, whatever you want to call it, but going out the next 5 years. We'll likely have another recession or depression within that time frame. So what do you think they're going to do? Well, if history is a teacher, it's just like monetary heroin, where each time you use the drug, you have to use more and more and more to have the exact same effect. But this time, it's just with fiscal deficit spending. So the US government debt continues to go up to a point where we go completely exponential. So going back in the future, if you will, if the next crisis we have 15 trillion and then it goes up even steeper after that, when we get to 2028, it's not outlandish to think they're going to spend even more money, and then pretty much you get to a point where this line goes completely vertical. The bottom line is every single time we have a problem with the economy, the central planners, the politicians, the authoritarians just spend more money, more money, more money, more money, and more money.
More money, more money, more money.
We have to assume that that's going to continue indefinitely into the future. So to be very clear, what I'm saying is I don't see any reason why the United States debt couldn't be at 50 trillion within the next 3 years and 100 trillion within the next 5 to say 7 years. Oh, but wait, there is more. Most of you know that my base case is the 2020s resemble the 1940s. Overall, it's a very inflationary decade, although we do have times when we have disinflation and maybe even outright deflation. Well, keep in mind that this debt going from 50 trillion or even up to 100 trillion doesn't even account for the rates of inflation that we will most likely experience throughout the rest of this decade. So then the next question becomes, okay, George, I get what you're saying here. It makes sense. If we continue on this trend, we'll definitely have problems. But who is going to be buying all of this debt? I'm going to explain that throughout the rest of this video. Reason number 2, what I call Triffin's paradox or Triffin's dilemma 2.0. Let's go right back in time to 1944, Bretton Woods. This is when the dollar officially becomes the world reserve currency. And you got this guy right here, obviously, Robert Triffin. Oh, the stick figures get better and better and better, don't they? So Robert Triffin comes in and says, okay, well, yeah, this dollar thing, world reserve currency, yeah, okay, but you guys are going to have a big, big problem. You're going to have to make a decision. Do you want to do what's best for the domestic common? Whoa. Do you want to hit my whiteboard there? Do you want to do what's best for the domestic economy or the international global economy? Because let's think this through. The global economy is going to need dollars to grow at the fastest rate possible, or on all 8 cylinders, if you want to use that phrase. So these countries are going to want to continue to get richer and richer and richer. But if we're all going to settle in dollars here, they're going to need a lot of those green pieces of paper, figuratively speaking. But that means the United States will have to run massive trade deficits, because if they don't run deficits, then how are those dollars going to get out of the United States to begin with? So if they're running big trade deficits, then what happens to things like manufacturing? That goes down. And we all know that the definition of wealth is how much a society can produce. How much stuff, how many goods and services can they produce efficiently? And if this continues over the long run, one way or the other, we will become poorer. Now, it is true, we're a lot richer than we were in 1944, but we were poorer than we otherwise would have been. And at some point in time, this game of musical chairs comes to an end. Now, Triffin's dilemma had a lot more detail than what we just outlined, but let's just focus on this so you understand the concepts. So the politicians sit back, your drunk, insolvent Uncle Sam, and they do the pros and the cons. So the pro to the United States spending more and more money, the dollar being the world reserve currency, and increasing deficits would be that these politicians get to spend more money, buy more votes. Also, the global economy would grow at full capacity. But let's not forget, the politicians would be able to spend more and more money. You see how I did that? For the politicians, they're like, oh, global growth? Oh, yeah, whatever. What? I can spend more money? Oh, hey, I'm in. But then the cons would be, like we said earlier, the manufacturing would go down, but the rates of inflation would be higher than they otherwise would be, domestic inflation. And as you guys know from watching my videos, the problem with debt isn't really the debt. It's the government spending that produces the debt, creating all of these economic distortions that at the end of the day has us manufacturing or producing a lot less goods and services than we otherwise would have. So the bottom line for these politicians, these central planners and authoritarians, the decision was very easy. They're going to take the path of least resistance. They're always going to want to spend more money and buy more votes. So let's just try to crank up those trade deficits and get as many of these green pieces of paper outside the United States we possibly can. But was this enough? Let's take a look at another chart going all the way back to 1940. Only goes to 2015, but you get the gist of it. On the left, we go from 0 trillion up to $100 trillion. This is global GDP. And I'd like to point out that this is real GDP, adjusted for inflation. Going all the way back to 1940, global GDP, call it around maybe 10 trillion, roughly. And then it goes up, but it literally goes up exponentially to a point now where, or at least in 2015, now it's a lot higher than that, it was over $100 trillion. Okay, well, let's think that through. If 60 or 70% of global transactions are settled in dollars, there is no way it would be possible for the United States to run enough of a trade deficit in order to supply the global economy with the dollars that it needs to grow at full capacity. Let me give some numbers here. Right now, just roughly, the US economy is about $25 trillion. Okay, well, let's just assume we're running a $100 billion trade deficit every single month. That's about maybe 1.2 trillion a year. Is that going to give the global economy enough currency units to grow at full capacity? Absolutely not. Whoa, time out. I know right about now, a lot of people, maybe in the Bitcoin space or the gold space, are sitting there and they're just punching the screen or however they're watching this video. They're just mad. Their face is red. They've got steam coming out of their ears. And they're saying, George, what are you talking about? The global economy doesn't need more currency units because we can just divide the currency units we already have. The dollar is divisible. And if Bitcoin was the global currency, we'd never have this problem because it's infinitely divisible. So you don't need more currency units. You just need to be able to divide the ones you have into smaller fractions. I get it. But notice throughout this whole video, I haven't been saying that the world or the global economy needs dollars to grow. I said it needs dollars or enough dollars to grow at full capacity. That's a big, big difference. And whether or not an economy can grow to its fullest potential with a limited amount of currency units that's being subdivided, well, that's a topic for a completely separate video. Now let's go ahead and insert this guy, the banksters, or the fat cat banksters. He's got his top hat there, and he is really greedy. You can tell by the fact that his eyes are actually dollar bill signs. And he sees this problem. he listens to Triffin and he says, well, yeah, wait a minute here. There's going to be a ton of demand for dollars outside the United States. And even the drunk, insolvent Uncle Sam himself can't get enough of those dollars outside of the United States through all of this deficit spending. So I see an opportunity. What if I go ahead and create the dollars? And this is what we call the Eurodollar system. This pops up in the mid-1950s. Now, all these banksters are making dollars or creating dollars by lending them into existence outside of the United States in the global economy. And they are providing the amount of dollars necessary to have this type of exponential growth. But they're doing it without any bank reserves. They're doing it without the Fed's balance sheet. They're doing it without green pieces of paper. So you ask yourself, okay, George, well, that makes sense, but how on earth are they settling if there's no settlement asset? Well, basically, they don't really need to. They just need to keep track of who owes who what based on a system, a network of ledgers. So without getting into great detail, the bottom line, the main takeaway, is this entire system of creating dollars that is now the global monetary system and what props up the entire global economy is built on two things, and two things only: trust and collateral. And when I'm talking about collateral, I'm talking about treasuries, government debt, and I'm talking about something like mortgage-backed securities. But let's not forget what happened to mortgages during the first GFC 1.0 in 2008. Well, they had some problems, to say the least. So what we could do is we go ahead and we delete that form of collateral. So it's no longer pristine. So now, in 2023, there's only one game in town as far as collateral. That would be treasuries, T-bills, in other words, government debt. I just switched up the whiteboard, as you can tell. Thank you, editor, because it gets even more interesting. So we know how this works now. We've got this Eurodollar system that's run by the banks. They've been funding all of this global GDP growth. But like we said earlier, back in 2008, the mortgage-backed securities hit the no bueno zone. And yes, that is a very technical term. So that means that the demand for those treasuries represented by this green line just skyrockets higher. And I know what you're saying right about now, George. Well, if global economic growth stagnates, flatlines, or goes down, then there's not going to be as much demand for treasuries. That's a very valid point. But let's go up to this little chart I just drew. And it's another global GDP. But this time, instead of the blue line, which represents that economic growth going parabolic, we've got it flat or even down. All right, well, what happens in this environment? Well, trust between those banks would plummet, would go down very, very quickly because there's a lot of risk. There's a lot of uncertainty, not just within the banking system, but with the dollar cash flow that's circulating throughout the entire world, with goods and services being traded for currency units constantly, and those currency units being used to pay down the debt that created those dollars to begin with. Okay, so if we assume that there's two components to this system, trust and collateral, if trust goes down, that would mean that demand for collateral continues to go up. It takes us to a very interesting place where we could see demand for treasuries continue to grow rapidly, regardless of whether or not we have an expansion or a contraction. I know a lot of you right about now are sitting back and watching this video and saying, okay, George, I get what you're saying about this Triffin's Paradox 2.0 thing. I mean, conceptually, it makes a lot of sense, but there's no way there's going to be enough demand to soak up another $70 trillion of government debt. Ah, yes, but I've got a very easy solution for you. It's called the Federal Reserve. They come in and buy whatever the market doesn't. Just like the Bank of Japan, we could wake up in 5 years and have 50, 60, maybe even 70% of the treasuries on the Fed's balance sheet. Reason number 3, Say's Law, or actually the bad version of Say's Law. I'm going to get to that in just a moment. So for those of you who don't understand this concept, it's simply supply creates its own demand. And this was thought about way back in the early 1800s by an economist, Baptiste, if I'm pronouncing his name correctly. Editor, go ahead and help me out with that one. And he had this idea that I think is very accurate, that production, in other words, creating goods and services, creates its own demand because people will have the currency units, however that's measured, to go ahead and buy more of those goods. And then you just have this positive feedback loop where the economy gets richer and richer and richer if everyone is producing. But I had a phone conversation the other night with one of the smartest guys I know. His name is Mike Green. If you're not following him on Twitter, you should definitely do so. And we talked about something that's effectively a bad version of Say's Law. So instead of production creating its own demand, in this case, destruction would create its own demand. Let me show you what I'm referring to. I've got this chart I drew of just hypothetical interest rates. On the left, we go from 0% up to 8%. Okay, let's assume that lately interest rates have been going up, especially at the front end of the curve. We all know that that has been true. But now the debt ceiling is no longer an issue for one, Janet Yellen. So she has said that she is going to issue $1 trillion worth of T-bills in a very short period of time, maybe over the next couple of months. Okay, well, if she creates all this additional supply and dumps it onto the market, there is an argument, I'm not sure that I agree with it, but there's an argument that interest rates would go up. Well, okay, there's an inverse relationship between the price and the interest rate or the yield. So I could see why some people would think this is how it would play out. Okay, well, let's assume that she dumps all these treasuries on the market and interest rates go up. But what does this create? A big problem for the real economy. So let's just assume for a moment that interest rates getting up to 4%. We'll just use Fed funds or the front end of the curve with these bills as an example. Well, this gives us the banking crisis. Silicon Valley Bank, Signature, First Republic, Credit Suisse, etc. All right, well, if she continues to issue more and more debt, and if as a result rates go up even higher, well, one would assume that that would create more destruction. So once these interest rates start to trickle through the economy, let's just assume that unemployment rate goes up even higher. Okay, well, if the government continues to run all these deficits, that means Yellen is issuing even more T-bills, more debt, which theoretically would make interest rates go even higher, which would create even more destruction in the real economy. As an example, I'm just using commercial real estate imploding completely. But if we have all of this destruction in the real economy and potentially financial markets, what's going to happen? The Fed's going to come in, they're going to do quantitative easing, they're going to drop rates, and the market participants are going to go from risk on to risk off. What I mean is there's going to be less demand for equities and far more demand for, you guessed it, treasuries. So one would assume that if there's all this additional demand for T-bills or treasuries, then the rates would go down because the prices are going up. So what this does effectively is it kind of puts a cap on interest rates because at a certain point, they go high enough, let's say, where enough destruction is being created to create more demand for the treasuries or T-bills themselves. And let's not forget that if we have this destruction happening, however you want to say that, recession, depression, commercial real estate blowing up, a GFC 2.0, what does that do to trust? Well, trust most likely goes down. And what does that do to demand for collateral in the global monetary system? It would go up as well. So looking at Say's law through the bad version of Say's law, it's like the good Superman and the bad Superman, right? But looking at it through this lens, we can see how your drunk, insolvent Uncle Sam could take the debt up to 100 trillion, and there would still be a lot of demand. Because in this case, again, destruction, because of those higher interest rates, would create the demand, which would keep the interest rates low, that would allow the government to continue to grow the debt. And let's not forget, while this was all happening, the Federal Reserve would likely be buying hand over fist. Now, would this create a lot of domestic consumer price inflation? Most likely, but interestingly enough, or maybe paradoxically, the United States dollar may even go up against other foreign currencies while it was plummeting against goods and services right here in the United States. But we'll save that for a topic of another video. For more content that'll help you build wealth and thrive in a world of out-of-control central banks and big governments, check out this playlist right here, and I will see you on the next video.